We are live. Oh my gosh. Welcome everyone. This is great. I've been really looking forward to this. I have to tell you. I really have. Because I'm a frustrated writer myself. So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone who is here with us today. Everyone who is online. I know we have an amazing audience. Welcome to our special speaker series at Wednesdays at the JCC, at the Miami Beach JCC. My name is Danny Reed. I am the Cultural Arts and Adult Programming Director of our wonderful facility. And it's so wonderful to be here today with all of you. We are here with three very special people, members of the Tuesday Memoir Writers Group and the Tuesday Morning Group, actually, is the more proper name, correct? The Tuesday Memoir Group. But we have a very, very special program with you. And I don't know about you, I don't know if anybody else has that frustrated writer inside of themselves that wants to come out. We all have family histories. We all have something that we want to share. And we're going to have a nice little hour with three lovely people who did just that, who took that step forward to write some of their family histories and some of their memories and bring it to the printed page. So welcome. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, but prior to that, I just want to thank everyone for being here today, to the Baptist Health who helps sponsor these series of events, and why don't we begin? Okay, so let's start, where are we going to start? Farthest and work our way over. Just introduce yourself.
I'm Tamara Nixon.
Okay, into the mic, Tamara.
Oh, sorry. I'm Tamara Nixon, a longtime resident of Miami Beach. I know a lot of you. And I'm going to start by telling you how we got started.
Well, can everybody just introduce themselves first? And also, when you speak into the mic, just make sure you point it directly, speak directly into it. Go ahead, if you can just introduce yourselves.
I'm Judy Wortman. I live here in Miami Beach with my husband, who's sitting here as well. And we also live in Boston. And Tamara and I know each other since the first or second day of college, but we connected when we moved back down here to Miami Beach. So it's been a long relationship.
Go ahead.
I'm Joy Malakoff, a former commissioner of the city of Miami Beach. I grew up partially in Miami Beach, partially in New York, but Tamara Nixon and I were at Miami Beach High School during the same period, and I'm back here permanently since 1971, and I love Miami Beach.
That's
and
great.
My neighbor.
And she's neighbors. That's good. Well, that's wonderful that we're all here online or in person. We're all a community. So obviously, the obvious question to start with, and Tamara, you said that you had something to say about that, is how you began, how you got together.
Well, I never met my grandparents. They had died before I was born, but I felt that I knew them because my mother always told these wonderful family stories about their adventures, their foibles, and so when my own parents and my husband's father died at a young age.
Tamara, can you, yes, you just need to speak right into the microphone, please.
Died at a young age, and I wanted to preserve the stories that we had told our children, which almost became like fairy tales over the years. I decided that it would be interesting to write them down, and they would be maybe like a biography or 1,001 Nights Tales that they would have as a legacy. Judy and I noticed at about that time that there was a little ad in the paper that at the book fair there was going to be a short seminar in memoir writing. It was going to be a 3-hour seminar, so we decided to go. It said it was limited to 30 people. When we got there, it was quite a bit more, but the person who was leading it was a writer herself, and she said, "I've given this course at college for 2 semesters, and I have offered it as a seminar for 9 weeks, but I have never done it for 3 hours." She said, "The thing that you have to remember when you're writing a memoir is think about something deeply, focus on it in your mind's eye, and then just write down all the details." So Judy and I and 3 other women from that time decided that we would get together and meet once every 3 weeks or so. We would write something, we would read it to each other for comments, and in the beginning we were even lucky enough to find through Judy a former editor of a large book publishing company who agreed to come and assist us, and that's how we got started. And we have been writing for 13 years, on and off.
Oh, so this was quite a while ago. So you said 13 years. So how long? Let me ask you this. So when in following that instructor's advice about focusing on something, what, for each of you, I'm just curious, what was the first thing that you thought of to write about?
The first thing that I thought of was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. I was 8.5 months pregnant, and I remember so vividly that I was in the kitchen. I remember the little roses on my maternity dress. I remember the clock. I remember my husband calling me from a payphone because he was so upset. He was driving on the Long Island Expressway, and he pulled over to find out if I was all right. And that was such a vivid memory. I just sat there and I thought about it, and that was the first thing I wrote.
Joy, what about you?
I joined this memoir group late. I was not one of the original women at that book fair where that woman started teaching. And so when I first joined, I was giving an assignment. Everybody in our group, in our memoir group, was asked to write about my mother. So I wrote a story about my mother and about some memories of her and how she wore her hair up in a chignon and things like that. But as the meetings continued, my most vivid memories, which I'll read from later, was I was 19 years old, just married, and my first home was in Tokyo, Japan. So my stories that I selected to print in our Tuesday Memoir Group book has to do with my trips to Japan. But I did originally start writing about family.
And Judy?
I found myself writing about people. As you will find out when I read my own excerpt, I found it very hard to really start writing about myself. In fact, I think a lot of people probably do. It's hard to start writing with the pronoun I when most of your life you've been writing in the third person, and you, the writer, are somewhat invisible. And so I began writing about a woman, and I will read an excerpt about her, who was a very, very dear friend of my parents and became sort of an alternate second mother to me. And I felt compelled to write about her, to honor her memory, and to, in a sense, relive the emotions that I had when she was alive and was such an important part of my life. But eventually, one of the things I wrote about most consistently was my friendship with a woman who I knew in Boston, who I'd known for many years, but when she was diagnosed with a terminal disease, ALS, I felt it's very important to keep a journal of my own feelings about her. And the journal eventually turned into a book. And I had to share my feelings with somebody. And going to the memoir group and reading out loud the things I wrote made me feel as if I wasn't writing alone, and having people around you to listen to you and to cry and to laugh and to, just understand what you're writing is extremely important. And I think I probably never would have finished the book had I not had my memoirists around me to help me.
No, that's wonderful. That I think that having they say that a writer writes. I've heard this before, where a writer writes, it's a lonely business, right? So at some point, there is that part where it's wonderful that you had this writers group through the years to help you to critique, and we'll talk about critiquing later, I think, because I'm interested in what process you developed to respectfully critique each other's work. But at some point, it's you alone with pen and paper or a typewriter or a computer, as we use nowadays, and that is a lonely process, and it's a very vulnerable process as well, I think, because you really are trying to get, and especially when you're telling personal stories, you're trying to get your personal stories, your deep thoughts, onto the written word. And then, of course, it's not stuck in a drawer. You were sharing it with other people. So that's even on another level. You're putting yourself on another vulnerable stage, I guess. Was that difficult at first for any of you, or was it something that became easy or stayed difficult through the years?
It's very interesting that you should ask, because each of us came to the idea of writing memoir for a different reason. Some really had a story that they wanted to publish. One had a story that she had already written and she just wanted to find a publisher. We sat down the first time with one of the women who had been in our group at this first seminar, and she wanted to write a rebuttal to a Mommy Dearest, I will call it, story that her sister had written about her own mother. And when she sat down and we discussed what the general rules would be, and that we would each write something and then we would share it for critique and then we would read it out loud in our meetings, she said, although she had wanted to publish this, I can't be in this because it's too personal for me to read out loud. And so she left. And we thought, isn't this amazing? She wants to publish it for the world, but she does not want to sit here and read it to the four of us.
But we used to say, as the advertisements for Las Vegas, what goes on here stays here. And after a while, we really did not feel we could invite anybody from the outside into our group, because there was so much that was not on the paper, but was discussed, should it be written down or not. And we were very careful to be confidential about everybody's information.
Well, it's an intimate process that you were all engaged in, and an incredible amount of trust, I think.
That's right.
Because in a moment where you're going to read parts of your essays that you wrote, but now you're revealing it to the world. But in the process of creation, it's an extremely personal process. Joy, I don't know if you have any other comment about that.
Not really. Thank you. I will say one thing.
Sure.
The stories that I selected to be published are all about Japan and the people, and my feeling is this was my first home. I was so young and so far away from home. My trunks didn't come for 3 months. And so it was, yes, a lot of feelings are in it, but it's different. What I wouldn't publish in the book, and which I haven't written down yet, is, for instance, about my divorce. That's personal, it's difficult, and it's something that, as of now, I have not written about. So it depends on the subject, and I think that's true of everybody here.
I think there was a tacit agreement not to write about our children. Because if we wanted to, we would have asked their permission, but we just decided not to. Am I correct?
Yes, yeah. We had been told by this writer that if you write anything personal about someone who is living, when it's published, before it's published, there is a due diligence process that the publishers go through. You have to let that person read it and decide whether they want to have it written, even if you just use the name of someone that you know in passing. They have to agree to it. One of the things that was interesting about getting together as a group is because we shared all of these memories over time, we all feel as if we grew up together, and there's an intimacy and a camaraderie that developed that was, I think for me, the best part of writing. I had no desire to publish. My idea was just to collect these stories in writing and then hand them off to my children, who might or might not read them now, but might read them at a later time.
So whose idea was it to publish an anthology?
I don't really remember. I think we probably sat around and threw out the idea just because we were chit-chatting about something before we actually started seriously critiquing each other's work, and then thought, well, why not? What do you think? I can't remember.
I
was
think
more precise than that.
The way we first decided to publish was Judy Wortman, because she wrote a book already. She published the book about her friend who had a terminal illness and her feelings, and it's a wonderful book. And after that was published, we thought, well, maybe we could do something like that, and that's where it evolved with the gentleman that Tamara mentioned before, who had owned a publishing book company and now was helping us, and he enabled us to get a book edited and published in a proper fashion. We didn't really know anything about doing it, but he did.
I think one thing that we should also say is that none of us is a writer. If you looked at the CVs, the resumes of all of us, you would never have expected, let's say 15, 20 years ago, that we would have a book published, that we would spend so much time writing. We all came out of other professions. And that fact that we could get together and write, I think, in part is the fact we were part of a group, and we really had the encouragement of each other.
No, that's great. That's wonderful. And I think that's a perfect point at which we can hear some of your writing. So we would love to hear something from the book. Tamara, you're going to start?
I'm going to read a short piece. My writing was a variety, more like essays rather than a chronological series of biography pieces. And the one that I'm going to read today from is an excerpt from something called My Growing Up in Erie. The kind of childhood we spent in Erie in the 1940s would be hard to imagine today. My friends and I led a typical small-town childhood experience, walking to school, stopping at the candy store on the way home, playing in each other's yards, riding our bicycles, unaware of the great historic drama that was happening on the outside world. Of course, I remember the ration stamps that my mother took in her purse when we went grocery shopping, and a closet in my parents' bedroom that was always locked and held things like bars of soap and rolls of toilet paper. It probably had supplies of other hard-to-obtain goods, but I paid little attention. We were a gang of 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. We were free to roam the neighborhood and cross the streets by ourselves. We were always together at someone's house. Sometimes it was Phyllis and Barbara's to play Monopoly or sew doll dresses or read Nancy Drew mysteries. Sometimes we went to Lina's house, where her aunt made cookies. Lina's mother lived in California. I think she was divorced. She had sent Lina to live with her aunt. Michael and Skip and some of the other neighborhood boys liked to play softball in one of the vacant fields across the street from my house, and the girls would watch. It never occurred to me that I was an only child. How different that was from my mother and father's childhoods, surrounded by brothers and sisters. She from a family of 5, he the youngest of 8 children. A few of my friends had a brother or a sister. Most did not. And besides, we were always together in groups of 3 or 4. If I thought about it at all, I felt that I was just lucky that my mother and father had even one child. She was 41 and he was 45 when I was born, the age of many of my friends' grandparents. Birthday parties were an annual ritual in our house. Mommy would tell me stories about special celebrations my father arranged on her birthday. Lavish dinners at fancy restaurants, bouquets of flowers, boxes of chocolates. The year I was in first grade, I planned a luncheon for her birthday. I did everything myself. I carefully unlocked the mahogany cabinet in the dining room and set the table with my grandmother's best Limoges china. I made egg salad, and for dessert, I served a parfait in the sapphire and clear, wavy glasses that were saved for special occasions. For the present, I conspired with my father to buy 2 place settings of sterling silver at Jarecki's, the fanciest jewelers in town. The pattern had a buttercup design. It was called Prelude by International Sterling. I had saved my allowance for months to be able to do this. I don't remember why I chose this gift. Perhaps I had noticed that Mother's other friends had sterling silver, and we did not. Or perhaps I just saw illustrations in the Better Homes and Gardens magazines that she read. I knew that she loved beautiful things. I always had a birthday party when I was a little girl. The one I especially remember was the year I turned 7. All my friends in the neighborhood were invited. Lina, Michael, Phyllis, Barbara, Marley, Denise, Skip and Barbara, Benji. We wore paper hats and played birthday games. My mother had a book of party games. I think I may still have it in one of our bookcases. There was Pin the Tail on the Donkey, Mother May I, a 3-legged race, and prizes for each winner. Lunch was a formal affair at the dining room. I don't remember the menu, except that there were baked potatoes, and Michael, who had a crush on me, hurled one across the table at me and missed. There was a yellow and white birthday cake with frosted roses and 8 candles, which I blew out with one big breath. After lunch, we all trooped into the hall. Mother arranged us on the circular staircase in 3 rows and took our picture.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You know, it's interesting what little details you remember, like that kid throwing the baked potato across the table at you. That meant he liked you, by the way. So, at least I'm assuming so. But can you tell us why that piece? Why did you choose that piece to share?
I think I chose that piece because people had said to me, the people that you read to today will find it so fascinating. Either they will remember those details for their own childhood or how different childhood was for their children or now is for their grandchildren. Even how free we were, how independent we were, how we played by ourselves, how we amused ourselves. There was no TV, there were no carpools. We walked to school. It was a different era.
Yeah, indeed it was. Well, so let's see. Who else do we have today? Would you like to read?
I'm going to read you an excerpt from the... Can you hear me? I'm going to read you an excerpt from the essay called My Other Mother. And my other mother's name was Evelyn, and I always thought of her as my fairy godmother, although she wasn't your typical Disneyland fairy godmother because she was about 5 foot tall, spoke with a New York accent with Yiddish undertones, not usually heard in Disneyland. Anyway, this is a short excerpt. Tell me how you met my parents. But I've told you already. I know, but tell me again. I love hearing the story. We are drinking coffee in her immaculate rent-controlled apartment in Flatbush. The coffee is strong, but compliments the slice of cheesecake I'm licking off my fork. Well, you know I was married before I met your parents. Yes, I knew. She had told me about her handsome but good-for-nothing husband, whom she had married at 16, only a few years after coming to New York. They'd opened a dance studio, but the depression and his gambling addiction sank that enterprise within months. He ran off, according to her, and left her with the bills. So I had to get a job. I could dance, but where was I going to work? I could barely speak English. Someone told me about your Aunt Sylvia, who needed a maid. She paused. You remember your Aunt Sylvia? I nodded and gave the expected response. My mother hated her, right? She was a bitch, excuse my language, but there's no other word for it. We both nod and silently curse Aunt Sylvia. Was she still alive? Anyway, she goes on. I was what you call a live-in maid. I did housework and cooked. On Friday nights, the whole family would come to your grandfather David's house for Shabbos. They lived on the Lower East Side. You remember? I nod again. Sometimes I dream of my grandmother's apartment with a large dining room, tiny living room, and in the hall a player piano. Your parents were living in Borough Park then, and Richard, your brother, was just a little boy. Sylvia told me to come with her to help your grandmother serve and clean up. When we arrived, I went to the kitchen, and the family sat down together at the dining room table. After your grandfather made the kiddush, your grandmother got up to bring in the fish. Sylvia told her that the maid, Chava, would bring in the food. You know that's my Hebrew name, Chava. I nodded, anticipating the climax of the story. Your grandfather shouted at your aunt, your maid is Jewish? I am not having a Yiddish maidel serving us on Shabbos yet. Shame on you, shame on you. So he went into the kitchen, took me by the hand, and made a place for me to sit next to him at the table. He kept telling me what a shena maidel I was, and how he would take care of me. Your grandfather was such a sweet man. I loved this story. To me, it was the Yiddish version of Cinderella. Evelyn never met a prince, but she met my parents at that dinner table, and their lives intertwined until death separated them. So what happened? How did you meet Joe? Wait, I'll make the coffee hotter, she says, and go to the stove to ignite the flame under the percolator. Here, Judith, have some more cake. I take another sliver of her melt-in-the-mouth cheesecake. No one can make cheesecake as good as hers. Smooth, creamy, tangy, but not too rich. Your parents would let me go back to Sylvia's house. They took me home with them, and I helped her with Richard. I helped them with Richard. He was 4, and your mother was pregnant with you. She was sick all the time and really couldn't take care of him. Eventually, they found me a job in a factory sewing gloves. Oh, it was hard work. How did you meet Joe? How did my parents introduce him to you? Your grandfather and Joe were landsmen. You know they both came from the same village in Poland, so your grandfather knew his family. I knew this and nodded my head. They would get together for social events, and someone told your grandfather about Joe. He was a greenie like me, but even more so, because he came to America a few years later than me. He wasn't married. Maybe he had a wife back in the old country. Who knows? Anyway, he was lonely and wanted to get married, so your grandfather introduced us. And Joe took me out. I remember your parents wanted to make sure he would treat me right. They insisted that Joe pick me up at their apartment for my first date. Your father sat Joe down and told him to treat me nicely because I was a good girl. Of course, your father and Joe were about the same age, but Joe listened to him. And then you got married. As I say this, I feel sad. This feeling always came over me when Evelyn would get to this part of the story. We saw no reason to wait. I liked him. He was nice-looking, clean, hard-working. He wanted a wife, someone to make a home for him. Maybe I didn't have what you call passion, but it was all right. A wife has to please her husband, and the husband has to take care of his wife. And I loved him. She stopped talking and smiling, sipped her coffee. Oh, were you angry when I went away on my honeymoon? You cried and shouted, Alimony, don't go. Your parents had to pry you off of me so I could leave. I feel embarrassed for my childhood tantrum. I get up to walk over to kiss her. I love you, Alimony, even though you married Joe and left me with my parents. Every time Evelyn told me this story, I wanted to write another ending. The ending would be that Joe and she took me away with them, and we all lived together in some fairy tale cottage. Here I am, a married woman with 2 children, but that childhood feeling of abandonment when she left with her husband persists.
Oh, thank you. So, Judy, why that piece? I asked the same question of you. Why did you choose that piece?
I think at some point I wanted to honor the memory of this woman who had died about, 20 years ago. She actually lived, I'll tell you a quick story, in something called the Shore Club on Miami Beach, but not the Shore Club that cost $1,500 a day. It was a Shore Club that cost $1,000 a month, kosher restaurant, 3 kosher meals a day, with entertainment at night and housekeeping. Things have changed. But I wanted to honor her memory. I never really had an opportunity to do so. I would tell my children about her, but they weren't really interested. I really thought writing it down was a way of doing this.
And this piece you wanted to share with us today because?
Well, because it tells you about my parents a little bit, about my grandfather, and I thought it was such an unusual story that this woman, who again ended up being such a very important part of my life, should have come into my life through this sort of strange series of circumstances in which, if my aunt had not called her by her Hebrew name, she probably still would have been in the kitchen and never would have become part of my life.
Well, it's true. It's astounding how little twist of fate, one action or one word can change a person's life and change the direction of a person's life.
Exactly.
So that was a beautiful demonstration of that as well. So, and last but not least, certainly not least, we have Judy. Joy. Sorry, Joy.
No problem. Thank you. The piece that I selected was about living in Tokyo. I mentioned that before. Barely 11 years after the peace treaty was signed with Japan after World War II, I was a 19-year-old bride flying to meet my new husband in Tokyo. He was there after his years at college. He was in the ROTC, and he had to then give this service to the Air Force. I worried that would my studies from Radcliffe College prepare me for this new life away from my parents, with whom I was very close, in a new country where I didn't speak the language, and how I would survive. And it was a difficult decision to go, but once I was going, I wanted to learn as much as I could about the culture and the country. That same year, prior to knowing that I would be living in Tokyo, I took a course at Harvard called Socksci 111, Social Science, and the nickname was Rice Paddies. It was 1 semester of China, 1 semester Japan. The Chinese professor was John Fairbank, who's a brilliant, well-known expert on China, and the Japanese professor was Edwin Reischauer, who later became the American's ambassador to Japan. I learned a lot in that course, never knowing I was going to need it in just a few months. The story I'd like to tell you is sort of an adventure story. We met a family in Japan through a contact of mine at Radcliffe, and the daughter was my age, and Toshiko, and she said, "Joy, while you're living in Japan, you must climb Mount Fuji. Everybody has to climb Mount Fuji once." So I figured, well, I did some climbing in summer camps at Mount Washington up in New Hampshire, so let's try it. So at 12,388 feet, Mount Fuji is the highest and most celebrated mountain in Japan. It has been admired and revered across the centuries. It has been featured in woodblock prints of the most famous Japanese artists, such as Hiroshige and Utamaro. It is arguably the most perfect volcanic cone in the world, and it is even visible from the city of Tokyo, some 60 miles away. There are ancient myths regarding resident deities, divine origins, and spiritual powers. The snow-covered peak is said to be the home of the fire god and the goddess of trees. Millions have made their pilgrimage, climbing to the peak of Mount Fuji over the centuries. Living in Tokyo, Mount Fuji seemed ever-present, and climbing it seemed to promise a once-in-a-lifetime experience, which it was. It is now listed as one of the 100 things to do before you die. Back in 1957, the pilgrims were 99% Japanese citizens, but there were no prohibitions against foreigners climbing this celebrated mountain. When I was 14 and at summer camp, I had climbed New Hampshire's Mount Washington, which is 6,288 feet in height. I felt climbing Mount Fuji would be an adventure at age 21. Al was very excited, my husband, was very excited, gathered the necessary information, and made the reservations to stay within Hakone National Park, so we would be ready early the next morning to start the climb. We had planned to arrive at the summit in time to spend the night, so we could see the sunrise the next morning. That was something that was recommended by my neighbor across the street in Tokyo. We drove to Hakone in late May and checked into the Fuji Hotel on Lake Ashi, a R&R, rest and recreation facility for the United States Armed Forces. We stayed in the Azalea Room, as each hotel room had a painting of a flower on the door. Early the next morning, we drove along Lake Ashi, past lovely weeping willows, cherry trees, yes, azalea bushes, and green parklands to the base of Mount Fuji. We parked near the pathway that would lead to the 5th station. We mounted donkeys. They may have been horses. I don't remember right now. But I think they were donkeys. It doesn't matter. To carry us up to the 5th station, Kawaguchi, as recommended to us by Shunichi, the eldest son in the home where we lived in Tokyo. We did rent a western wing that was approved by the Air Force in a beautiful Japanese home with a Japanese family, a widow who had 4 children. The eldest son spoke English, and that was Shunichi, whom we became very friendly with. We parked near the... we were presented with tall wooden walking poles to carry with us. I had never realized that donkeys had such skinny, bony backs. Once we reached the 5th station, we learned that the poles were to be stamped at each station. They were sort of branded when you got to each station with a hot brand that marked the pole. The wooden poles helped us climbing the mountains and became treasured souvenirs. It was already quite hot. We were covered with sunscreen, wore caps, and carried waters, sandwiches, and rice crackers in our backpacks as we headed up the rocky path. Unlike Mount Washington's lichen-covered gray stone, Mount Fuji is volcanic. Its rocks mainly black with many reddish-black stones. Also, unlike the climb up Mount Washington, mountaineering skills were not needed. We were not climbing up mountain rocks and faces, watching our footing across large boulders. This was a rocky path, winding always upwards. We certainly felt the altitude changing as we climbed higher, feeling lightheaded and a little dizzy. As we passed each station, we stopped to rest, drinking more water and purchasing tea to drink with the sandwiches we had packed. The weather turned colder as we climbed. Along the way, we visited the rudimentary outhouses, always a smelly ordeal. We knew to carry tissues in our pockets. After around 8 hours, we passed the 10th station and arrived at the hut at the top. This large dormitory-style room was extremely primitive. That's an understatement. There was, of course, an outhouse, equally primitive. Inside the hut were sleeping bags, futons, a wooden floor, and dozens of Japanese men. I was the only woman in the room and felt all eyes watching me. I whispered to Al, "What am I doing here? None of my friends will ever believe I slept in this huge hut with 40 Japanese men and you." We bundled up in our sweaters and jackets, lay in sleeping bags on the floor, and tried to sleep, listening to a chorus of snores around us. I couldn't help thinking about fleas and bed bugs jumping around the sleeping bags all through that long, uncomfortable night. At last, it was morning. The weather was freezing, with only a few pockets of snow in shaded spots. Again, we bundled up with hats, gloves, and every sweater and jacket we'd brought with us. The sunrise, gold, orange, and yellow, was glorious, a sight always remembered, even 60 years later. It felt as if we were inside a heavenly sky. The trek down Mount Fuji was faster but difficult. The angle was steep with so many loose stones and rocks, we half slid down the mountain. My rear end was not only covered in red dust, but sore as well. As we wended further down the path, the weather warmed up and we started peeling off our layers of jackets and sweaters. At last we reached the base and found our car. We proudly packed the climbing poles into the car for the drive back to the Hotel Fuji to shower, change, and then return to Tokyo. Today, that Mount Fuji pole, branded with each station, is a proud souvenir in my Miami Beach home. The little Japanese flag on the top may have tattered, but the memories of that adventure are still strong.
So it's very interesting to me. I mean, we heard a lot. You said a few words, Joy, about just how significant living in Tokyo and living in Japan was for you. But it's very interesting what you each chose to share with us. Childhood memories, a story in adulthood about a woman who had an effect on your life and how something that happened changed her life dramatically, and then a life-changing memory or memory of for all life in a foreign country. So it's the variety is really, really welcome, and just is a great demonstration of what the possibilities are when you write memoir. I would like, I think we have some questions, and maybe if you in the audience watching from home, if you have some questions, you can put them in chat, and we'll see them in a minute. But before we turn to questions, I want to ask you, do each of you have something to say about your own personal writing process? Because it is a process. You've discussed like what you wanted to write about, or what you wanted to write about when you did the memoir writing. But what about your personal process? How do you write? When you say, okay, today I'm going to write, what do you do? What's your process?
I write on an iPad, and I use a program called Pages. And you bring up a new document which is blank, and I've already thought about what I want to write about. And for instance, I got a new dog, a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and she became part of our lives. And I knew I wanted to write.
Just one second. Yeah. Need silence. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
I wanted to write a story about this little dog. And so I just sat down and I wrote about how we got the puppy in the first place, how we picked her up at the airport, and the feelings we had, and how she acted, our car trip home, etc. And as I'm writing, what's so interesting is as you're actually writing about experience, especially when it's a recent experience, images come vividly to mind, and that's what you try to capture. And I find that when I'm writing, those images come and I write about them. But if I'm just thinking at home about, well, I think I should write a story, nothing comes to mind. You have to think of I have to. It may be different, I'm sure it is for each person. I have to think of a topic, a situation, a place, a feeling before I start writing. And that's my experience.
Do you have any ritual?
No.
No?
Just
Some writers have rituals.
No, just opening the iPad and going to Pages.
I think one thing that helps if you are in a situation that you're not really quite sure how to describe it is to keep a journal. And sometimes if you are keeping a journal, and I think that's what I did when I was writing the story about my friend Susan who died of ALS. You think you're writing only for yourself because no one is going to see the journal, and then you feel uninhibited about what you're going to put down because again it's only for you, and eventually you may find that it's going to coalesce into something that other people may want to share, and when you write a journal, you can remember places, smells, dialogue, the sense of what just happened that may be hard to obtain later on if you're trying to get it out of your long-term memory. So that's just a hint. Doesn't mean that everything you write comes from a journal, but it does really help you. And one of the authors in our book, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, wrote a book about her early life after she graduated college, and a lot of it came from journal keeping, and it was remarkable because she remembered people and dialogue and events that later on she knows she would have forgotten. So that's just a hint that may make writing easier.
Well, mine is a little different because, as I said, I wanted to preserve family stories that I had heard again and again or that we had told. One of the things that I found, if I heard a piece of music or I saw a photograph, it would remind me of something. And we had been told in this first seminar that when you're writing, if you don't worry about the punctuation, you don't worry about anything else, you just spill everything out on the page, and then you go back and you look at it again, you'll find that you should edit it. You'll edit it. If you might edit it 3 or 4 or 5 times to get it to something that you want to say, in the same way that if you were painting a picture, you would go over and over it. The other thing that I found is that I know that a number of people write journals, but I think that in journaling, you're frequently told to journal because you're going through a difficult time. There's an emotion that you can't share with anyone else, but if you write it on the page, it calms you. For me, in writing a memoir, the memories that pop up are the really happy, pleasant events, and you savor the moment as you write them. In the same way, if you saw a wonderful video again or a photograph. And so for me, the memoir writing is very different than journaling.
All right. So, but was it? Is it cathartic in a way, though, to write, to put all this down?
I wouldn't say that it's cathartic. It's more like a conversation with someone else, that you're telling a delightful story, that you're having dinner, or you're telling a bedtime story.
But
go ahead.
But I've had the experience of wanting to write something that happened to me, and it's in my memory, and sometimes the whole event comes out as a totally complete picture. I mean, one of the things that I have in the excerpt is when I went to a mikveh for the first time, and that experience was so salient that when I wanted to write about it, and it's as if I was simply living through it as I put it on the words on the paper. I never changed a word. It's sort of like sometimes people can write a poem, and it just comes out of your head, and you think, wow, where did that come from? And you know you can never do it again, but it's just there calling to be let out, and that's what memoir writing can do as well.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The other thing that I wanted to say is that we wrote over a period of 11 years or so, and I noticed that depending upon what was life for me or what was happening in the world at the time, the quality of the writing or the tone of the writing could be very different.
Well, that's understandable. I mean, you're reacting to the world around you, but it's bringing up memories that you wanted to put to paper as well. All right. Any questions? We have a question.
Well, I have a question
From
the Zoom audience.
Okay.
So I'm scribing here. And so Molly wanted to know, did you have an intended audience when you put this book together? And, were you always intending to, publish this book at the beginning, or was this something that evolved? I mean, you told us a little bit about the evolution of it, but, who was your intended audience? And that was, and then a follow-up that Debbie asked also is what has been the reaction to the book from family, friends, and other people out there?
Well, I could start that. I think that the reason that we decided to do the memoir is it was a year that we felt all written out, and we didn't really know what we wanted to write, and we did not want to end the group, and we didn't want to just have it as a luncheon group. And Judith had an editor that she had worked with, and he suggested, well, why don't you each pick 3 or 4 of your favorite pieces that you've written in the past and put them together as a book. Some of us never even thought that we would think of publishing. But we did it because it was a group project for that year.
So who's your intended audience?
Well, I have to tell you who should not be your intended audience, your children and your grandchildren. I know it's going to sound horrifying, but how many of us have given our works of art to our children? Oh, yeah, I'll read that later. When I get around to it, I'll read it. And did you read it yet? Well, yeah, I'll get around to it. So you think that your words will suddenly go into their head and they'll be so happy to read it sometimes.
My daughter was. She
1 out of 3.
Yeah, 1 out of 3. She read it and she loved it. She commented on it because in our home we have many things from Japan. So she was sort of as the older next to oldest. She and a literary child. She really did enjoy it, but the 2 boys not so much.
And I found that for my children, they loved to hear it read aloud. We discovered after Dan died, for example, that he had written every day to me when he left for Vietnam till he came home. And we read the letters aloud. And one of the pieces that I had written was a short piece about how we left for Vietnam. And that is going to be the introduction to this publication of all of his letters. There were 215 pages of letters over a 3-month period. He had been an English major, and he was a wonderful writer. So what he did is he didn't just talk about what was happening around him, but the politics, the people he met. So it's been fascinating to them, and we read that out loud. It's too much work to sit down and read the whole thing, but reading excerpts out loud has been wonderful.
Oh, that's great. We have a question.
It's an apology for leaving the room just before my wife was speaking.
That's okay. That's
I
okay.
want to explain what it was. This is sort of half in confidence. The person who called me was the new president of the New World Assembly. What's his last name?
Howard
Herring.
The president.
Herring.
Yeah, anyhow. And he called me because we're having a correspondence about the complications that he now faces as a new president, given the fact that Michael is not as well as he might be. So I really had to take the call.
That's okay. We understand. So, any questions from the audience? Okay, we have one in the back right over there, and then we'll move forward.
I just was going to ask you guys about the publishing process. How did that, once you spoke to this editor, did he help you, or did you just self-publish, or?
How about the publishing process? You mentioned that you have an editor. You had an editor that helped you edit it and formulate the book, but you printed it through a traditional publishing house or one of those print-on-demand publishing houses?
He's somebody who makes a livelihood editing, but all he did was format things for us and show us how to. It's self-published. Show us how to. I guess put your work in the Library of Congress. You have to get a special, catalog number, etc. And he helped us with a cover. Well, we argued among ourselves for quite a while about that. But really just formatting. It's a skill that one obviously can learn, but we didn't, and he had it. That was about it.
And I think, wasn't he the one that arranged that you could buy it through Amazon?
That was right. Kindle.
Yeah. You can get it.
Yeah.
A Kindle published it. You can get it on Amazon, and it comes just in the paperback like this.
Correct. Yeah, because because it is a self-published. We don't have copies here because it is self-published, but we do encourage you to buy the book. It's some wonderful stories. You can get it through order it through Books and Books, which is our local independent bookseller, or Amazon.com as well. We have a couple more minutes, and there's one more question here.
Thank you, ladies. It's a wonderful, wonderful experience hearing your stories. I was under the impression, however, that a memoir was each of you individually, your life stories from when you were born till now.
Oh.
But you all chose, because it was a club, to just pick out segments for this book. So do you have any suggestions for a person who would like to write their entire life memoir, how to go about it?
Well, actually, memoir is a group of essays at a particular point in time, not necessarily a biography. And what you would like to do is an autobiography. And basically, one of our group actually has a book that has turned out like that from the memoir writing. What she did is when she had a memory, she wrote it down, not necessarily chronologically. And then after she had 15 or 20 or 30 pieces, she saw how they interrelated, that they were at various times in her life, various experiences, and then she began to put them together as a biography from that, for an autobiography.
And then I have one from the audience.
Okay.
Phone as well.
Go ahead.
You wrote these as adults, and when you were writing as an adult, could you write from an earlier period, take a step back as an adult, and see it differently and regard it differently, even if you didn't put it down?
Judy, that's a brilliant question. And one of the things we talked about was, when you're writing the memoir, should you put in an insight that you had as an adult that you clearly did not have as a child? And would that change it? Would it make it more readable and more relevant? Or should we just keep it as the memory? I don't think we ever actually found an answer to that. It really was dependent on your own feeling about it. But I anyway wrote as an adult, but could bring myself back, I think you did also, Tamara, into a childhood state of how I really felt at a certain time.
And when you're writing as a child, I mean, you're thinking back how it was when you were a child, those memories are very vivid. Every day we go about our business and we don't really think about it. But if you're concentrating on writing a story about how you celebrated Christmas when you were a little child and you lived and you were Jewish and you were celebrating Christmas, those memories of how you felt, or the one that we all wrote about, our mother, and you remember those, and those feelings become very vivid as if you were still a child, how you felt then. Yeah. So I think something to do about writing it down brings it into focus in your mind.
Yeah, it's almost as if the memories begin to unfurl in your head. You don't think you can remember anything. And then all of a sudden there's so much coming out that you can barely get it on the computer.
So the floodgates open in a way. That's one. I think there was one last question, Karen. You?
Yes, and it's a good wrap up, which is, what are you working on now, and sort of how do you keep the ideas flowing and take us to what's happening right now in your writing group?
Well,
yeah.
What I mentioned before is, after we found all of these letters that my husband had written, I was about to try to have my editor take all of my memoir writing, which might be 40 pieces over the 11 years, and put them together. We decided to put that aside because his piece is so historic. We are planning to give the original letters, which are on onion skin, probably to his college library archive. But to be able to just have it all written down so that someone could read it with some of the photographs. So I'm working on that now, and just interposing 2 or 3 of the memoir pieces which were related to that period of time. So it shows what we did before, what I did when he was away, interposed with the letters that he wrote.
Yeah. I wrote a short piece this past summer, the summer 2021, based on the fact that it was called The Journal of a Duck's Midwife, based on the fact that when we returned to Boston, I found a female mallard sitting on 8 eggs in a terracotta planter on my 12th floor balcony, and wasn't sure what was going to be the outcome of this. Happily, the ducklings hatched, but I kept a journal during this time. all but sat on the eggs when the duck left to board on Saturday nights away from the nest. But so that was my latest magnum opus, as it were.
I have not been writing. I find during the pandemic, for some reason, my brain shut off. So it's just different, and I have not been writing. Our group has not met for quite a while, but I hope that we will start up again and start writing again.
Well, as the pandemic hopefully winds down, I hope, Joy, that you start writing again. And Tamara, Judy, and Joy, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us in the audience and on Zoom. It's the Tuesday Memoir Group. And again, Books and Books or Amazon, you can buy a copy of the book, and hopefully we'll see a volume 2 as well.
And
So-
I just want to give a shout out for the JCC. It's wonderful to be back. More and more of us are coming back in person, and it is such a different experience to be here than to be on Zoom. So I encourage you, if you haven't tried it yet, to come. It's very safe, it's very fun. You'll see a lot more of your friends again.
Thank you, Tamara. And on that note, just one last, maybe a shameless plug. Tomorrow we actually do have another book event. David Wheel will be here with his memoir called Exhale, and a life in transplant. This is a transplant doctor who for 10 years ran the Lung Transplant Institute at Stanford University Hospital until he had to kind of like take a step back. And he wrote a memoir about his experience. So tomorrow, 12:30 in this very room. Please join us if you can in person or online. But we hope to see you all tomorrow as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for
Thank you,
coming.
Danny.